Hi, this is Andrew Sears, and I'm here with Bob Andringa. Bob is a Christian who is probably the most knowledgeable person about Christian boards and just boards in general. He wrote the board answer book, the first and second edition of the book that our students are using in our board management course. Bob, can you just share a little bit about your background and experience with nonprofit boards, both from your experience directly with them, but also in teaching and training others in it?
Sure. It really happened for me in 1980 after working for U.S. House of Representatives, a big board in itself, and then for a governor in Minnesota. And then I took a job on 24-hour notice. I should have researched it more, but was to be the CEO of the Education Commission of the States based in Denver. And I got there, and within a few days, I learned that I reported to a board of 55 people, one-third governors, one-third legislators, one-third state education officials. And of course, after 5 years, I was desperate for learning more about governance because that was totally dysfunctional, with a different governor being my chair every year of a different party. So when I left ECS, I thought, gosh, I want to move out of the political secular world, and I want to do something with kingdom work. And I didn't know what that would be, but I wrote 35 Christians who were CEOs of Christian parachurch organizations and just saying, do you need any help? I think I could help on leadership, on governance structure and process, mainly from what I learned did not work. And gee, that launched my consulting practice in 1985, which dates me. But I'm still doing that. And the Lord just somehow gave me a real interest in learning and then teaching and sharing. And so at this point, since 85, I've trained or consulted directly with close to 500 parachurch organizations. And then Ted Engstrom was president of World Vision International, and he was a guru along with Peter Drucker and others on governance. And he invited me to co-author a book with him. He had written many books, and as you, Andrew, mentioned, we wrote the first 3 iterations of the nonprofit board answer book, and then they reminded us that they owned the copyright and decided to go with Josie Bass, and they've done a couple iterations as well. So it's a great book for board members. You can assign chapters that are short to a board member and have them report on it later. And then I've been CEO of a statewide organization, a national organization, the Education Commission, and then 12 years CEO of the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, which was in 20 plus countries. And I've been chairman of a board a couple times and served on boards. So I've had it from both ends, and I still love it. That's the amazing thing. Every board has a different culture, and to understand that culture and then to help them see the best way to function is always a challenge, always fulfilling.
Yeah. Well, Bob, that is some amazing experience. I didn't know all that. Training 500 boards. There's very few people who could say that. And a lot of the boards you're a part of, not everyone has governors on their boards, but also CCCU is, that's the alliance of all the largest Christian liberal arts schools, evangelical Christian liberal arts schools in the country. So leading that, you've had to deal with a lot of different, groups. So it's an honor to have you sharing. So thank you, Bob. So let's start with, the first question really is around what's your advice for recruiting board members? How do you build a pipeline? what are common sources for new board members? How do you foster, you know, for Christian ministries, you know, it's not just like a secular board. It's kind of like you're asking people to be yoke fellows with you. So there's a high level of trust. You know, how do you develop that? And, you know, what would be your recommendations for an organization with an executive director, and, you know, current board members that have limited access to those resources? That's a lot of questions, but the idea is a lot of our students are in smaller organizations. They want to have these big, awesome boards that, you know, like CCCU has, or at World Vision, or whatever. But what they're stuck with is you know, they started with their, you know, people they knew. And a lot of times, you know, about half of our students are coming from under-resourced backgrounds themselves, so the people they know are in under-resourced backgrounds. So how do they move forward? How do they build a pipeline and address
Sure.
those dilemmas?
Good questions. Well, as you mentioned, when a founder starts a nonprofit, they discover they need to have a board of directors, and they're usually friends. And often these friends don't really care about the mission and the programs. They just want to support their friend, the founder. And so I recommend that that initial board be no more than about 5 people. Get started, develop some of the tools for governance, and then let those 5, not the CEO, to depend on the CEO to find and recruit all board members usually leads to dysfunction when that CEO leaves the scene. So we want to recruit board members whose passion is for the mission of the organization, not just to help a friend. So those 5 could help recruit, put in a pipeline, 4 or 5 others. And when they're added to the board, now you may be at 7 or 9 people, then they are recruiting people from their network. So we're always looking for potential board members. Every day, the board, staff, donors, they're all looking for people who have a passion for the mission. I like to say, when you're looking at people, think of people who could provide at least 3 of 5 W's: wisdom, work, wealth, wallop, and witness. Well, what does wallop mean? Well, I was working with the board of a university, and they knew that they didn't have any younger people on the board who really understood technology. So they got a young vice president of one of the big tech companies, hardware, mainly hardware and software, like Intel. And he came on the board, and after a while he said, you know, I think the university has some outdated systems. Our corporation actually has people who go in and help you assess your needs. And then once in a while, we actually donate new hardware and software. And of course, the board said, yeah, why not? And the president said, of course, come on in. Well, it ended up that they got several $1 million worth of new hardware and software because of one board member's wallop. He had clout, he had influence in an important other organization. And witness means that they are people, your board members are people of credibility, of integrity, of character. They are known to represent the best of Christian character, and you want people like that on your board. Wisdom, of course, comes oftentimes with age. And I think good board members are those who took early retirement or even 65. They have lots of experience, lots of networks, lots of trial and error. They've learned the hard way. They have lots of wisdom. They should be among those that you're putting in a pipeline. Work, of course, means are they willing to put in some time, not just come to board meetings unprepared, but to prepare in advance, read the advanced materials, research what other ministries similar to yours are doing. Take time to actually go visit some of those. Take time to come and visit your own programs. So that's work, it's time. And then wealth. They should be willing to give significantly at whatever level that means. It could mean $100 a year. It could mean 50,000 a year, but they should all bring a commitment to be donors of record. All of them should be donors of record. They should expect that of themselves every year. And then some of them, of course, would have networks of Christians that also have significant wealth. So wisdom, work, wealth, wallop, and witness. Those are 5 keywords to think about. So you're putting all of these people on a list, on a spreadsheet, let's say, where you're noting some things important about them. On my website, I have what's called a profile. It's what do you want your board to look like? What kinds of talent do you need because of who you are? There's various profiles out there, but be deliberate, be strategic. And let's say now you have 8 people in your board of 5. Well, I like to have the board chair and or the CEO invite those 8 one at a time to a breakfast. Tell them what you're doing. See whether they get excited about it. You might ask them if you're feeling good about them. You might say, would you be willing to be in our pool of potential board members someday? And they may say, well, gosh, I don't know about that. And you say, well, we have an orientation session for people like you. And we'll give you some insights into our organization. We'll go through our policies and basically how we're structured. We'll show you our budget, and we'll give you a briefing on our programs. Now, if they say, that sounds like more than I want to do at that time, well, you're probably going to move them to the bottom of your list, right? You might even feel led to say, if you think what we're doing is important for the community, would you be willing to be one of our donors? Could we invite you to be a donor? Now, these are on the list of potential board members, right? But if they say, as a couple, we do give to a lot of ministries, but to be honest with you, I'm not sure that this would interest us at this time. So what are you thinking? You're thinking, well, someone thought they might be a good member, but we've checked them out, and no, without criticizing them in any way, we thank them for the breakfast and we move on down the list, always adding to the list, always going through this pre-election orientation. I think there's a chapter in the book that talks about 2 kinds of orientation. Once they're elected down the road, then they have a deeper orientation. They need to know more as a board member. I'm coming to believe, after all these years since 1985 working with boards, I'm coming to believe that people who own their own businesses, so they manage their own time, or are retired. As I look around our church, it's a large church, there are probably 1,000 men and women who have outstanding experience and are retired. And more these days, people can be 80, and I'm pushing that. They can be outstanding board members. When you look for entrepreneurs who've earned a lot of money and might be a big donor for you, generally it doesn't work. Entrepreneurs are those who wake up in the morning, they have an idea, they do it. And when they get on the board and they say, well, let's have this committee or that committee work on this for 3 or 4 months and bring back a recommendation, that frustrates them. Plus, they get inside the organization and they find that, yeah, like any organization, there's some dysfunctional areas. And entrepreneurs who are usually doers and they want to do it well, they like excellence, they get frustrated with that. So in all those board training sessions I've done, many board members would come up to me at a break and say, Bob, you know, I sort of enjoy being on this board, but if I knew then, when I said yes, what I know now, I probably wouldn't have joined the board. And that's one of the reasons to go through this little pre-election drill of seeing how interested they are. So there's some thoughts, Andrew. I also think that you need to identify people and give them something to do to see how they function in your ministry and as a volunteer and as working with other people. So build a volunteer corps and ask people to serve on ad hoc task forces. Create one or more advisory groups of 3 to 5 to 7 to maybe 10 people. Look at your consistent donors. Ask who would be able to give time as well as talent, money. And then engage. And pretty soon, those who function in a group setting as a volunteer, they sort of rise to the top. They then get on your list of potential board members. And again, I would say, don't ever let the CEO do what the board should be doing. The board is responsible for its own development, its own level of performance, and to sort of delegate to the CEO and say, hey, give us, we've got 2 openings, give us 2 names. That's not good. That's not good. Now, most of those 8 we had on the list, they're going to be exposed to the CEO, but they aren't there only because the CEO put them on the list. Anybody can put a potential board member on the list. And finally, talk to staff at good churches. The people who know the laymen and women in the congregation, tell them you're looking for good people who have these kinds of qualities. And usually they will have a few names for you to put on your prospective board member list. Well, that's a lot, Andrew, but those are things that came to mind.
Yeah, that's really helpful practical advice. I really like the idea of pre-election orientation and the concrete steps you can take to do some vetting. You know, I think part of what you're saying is with those 5 W's, you know, you can vet, you know, if you give them a volunteer task and they don't do well, then, you know, they're probably not going to be in the work, you know, and if you ask them to donate and they don't, then, you know, they may not be in the wealth category. And then, you know, there's a question is, are there other things that they're bringing? So that's helpful. Now, what's your recommendation? And part of the problem that we run into is, and this was me, you know, whenever in my background I was at MIT, I knew a lot of wealthy people. I knew a lot of resource people, a lot of people who had all 5 W's. Then I moved into the hood, so to speak, and I attended a church where the majority of the people are, you know, below the poverty line. And I was lucky to know people who had, I knew a lot of people who had the wisdom thing, but, you know, the other 4, do you have recommendations for people in organizations? And probably a third to maybe half of our students, they're stuck in low social capital networks, to put it in technical terms.
Okay.
And so they and their board don't have access to high social capital people. What are your thoughts about that type of challenge?
What comes to mind is, first of all, don't think you need a bigger board than you need. You need a lot of people, a lot of volunteers, but I'm a small board guy. The average board size of, what is it today, 1.8 million nonprofit 501c3s. 2/3 of them probably have budgets less than $75,000 a year. So huge community, most of them very small. Many of them start every year, 10,000, 20,000 start a year, 10,000, 20,000 probably close every year because maybe they've tried to do too much. So keep the board small, keep it focused on governance, not on helping staff manage things. That comes with wearing a volunteer hat. The governance hat is where you meet as a board and you do macro level strategic thinking, strategic planning at a macro level. And a board policies manual, which is mentioned in the book and on my website, I've got information about that, wrote another book on that. So start small. The vast majority would have had no training in governance. Maybe a couple had been on one other board, and so they think they know how governance works. But if they've been on a dysfunctional board, they're telling your board, hey, this is how we're supposed to do things. Not often. So you want to, as a staff member, an executive director, you want to say to the board, let's learn governance together. Would all of you be willing to read one book, practical book, or one article, or one piece of data about the nonprofit sector? Let's all read something, and then at each meeting, let's have a 10-minute sort of book report, out of which several of you will have an idea, say, this is an idea that I read about, which I think we could use. And that goes maybe to a board development committee or a governance committee, whatever you call it. It's good to have that committee.
Yeah. Okay.
And then online today, compared to when I started, it's unbelievable how many webinars there are on. I was on maybe 4 or 5 last week. There are many YouTube videos on governance. There are organizations that have regular free emails about what's going on in the sector. So in the Christian world, the ECFA, Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, it's a membership organization for churches and parachurches. That's one. Candid is the new name of a couple merged organizations full of information. Board Source, by far the one place to go for articles and tools and so forth. And then many, when you can afford it, if it's a fee involved, or maybe it's a pro bono, you have a consultant trainer in when there are obvious tough questions and the board is just at a stalemate. Example of that would be, should we have an executive committee, and how does it function so that the rest of the boards don't feel left out of decision making? Another one would be term limits. Should we have them? Should we not have them? What's the best way to deal with term limits? Another topic would be evaluation. We kind of know we should evaluate ourselves, evaluate our programs. How do we do that? How do we do an annual performance review of our CEO? Lots of ways to do that. We want to do it well. So maybe a consultant is going to be the quickest way to get to best practices there. Those come to mind, Andrew. What else comes to your mind?
Yeah, well, so what I hear you saying is, if you're kind of stuck in this limited social capital, it's the divides we have in the world and the divides we have, that's a problem that's not super easy to fix, but part of what you can do, it's kind of like, as I put it, if someone's having a hard time getting employment, well, part of what you can do is, increase your own capacity, get education. And so if your board has a limited capacity in a smaller organization, part of what you're saying is one solution is to use training to increase its capacity. And I think through that training, that might help board members identify, you know what, we do need to get more high capacity, maybe especially people with the wealth side of things, or the wallop side of things. And it might invite some creative thought on how to expand that. Now let me jump into my other questions that are somewhat related, and I think you've somewhat answered these, but
Can
I'll
I comment on that, the
yeah.
wealth, in just a minute? Don't recruit board members solely on that. That's one thing where a few board members should have connections. Usually people of wealth associate with people of wealth. They're in the same clubs. They socialize together, they play golf together, and so forth. So when you get one or two of those, that's terrific, and their network then becomes good ground to work. But most churches have a missions budget, and I think any parachurch organization should try to get a seat in front of the missions committee and convince them that you are in the city, you are doing things with immigrants, the homeless, the street kids, the addicts, that the church is not able to touch directly. You would love for them to be one of your financial supporters. Once you have that relationship with that church, then you also say, can you help us build our board? We're going to have 2 openings because we have terms. We're going to have 2 openings coming up in 4 months. Can you identify a few people that we could, take to breakfast and go through that
Right.
drill
Yeah.
in a pre-orientation?
Yeah. That's good. Okay, so the next 2 questions, and I think you've somewhat answered this and somewhat related. So, what recommendations would you have for new or fairly young organizations in their board development priorities? And then the other one is, a lot of the, and I've talked with our students a lot, right? And I hear different criticisms of the standard. And let me just throw out what the criticisms are of the standard. So there's a lot of people who come from the CCDA movement. And I had a friend who's in the CCDA movement, and they're very much focused on, how do you have Indigenous leadership? And, so one of my friends said, most of the board advice boils down to get a bunch of rich white dudes on your board that believe in your mission. And, I think that's cynical, but, that friend says, I don't know any rich white dudes. So, but so you have the young organizations, you have the under-resourced organizations. The other one is there's also large organizations. Most of the books are written for larger organizations. So, how might the recommendations change, particularly for younger organizations, smaller organizations? Part of what I heard your advice on the other thing is not every organization, like you said, yeah, a lot of the nonprofits have $75,000 budget or less, right? So they're not going to need necessarily a super high capacity, a millionaire who's going to give them a ton of money, they may already have the right boards, so they just need to learn some of the other best practices. But anyway, so young organizations, smaller organizations, how would things be different?
Well, in small organizations, usually you have a vision of growing. So it's important to develop a culture early on while you're new. Don't get in bad habits. And one thing that might help you would be that every board member wears 4 different hats. The one hat is a governance hat. And the governing board has one agent, the CEO, executive director, president, by whatever title. The governance hat is the group that legally is accountable to the public and to the donors for the organization and what happens. So the governance hat should stay at the governance level, flying at 10,000 feet. Stay out of management, get out of the weeds when you're wearing the governance hat. Now, when you're small, you don't have a lot of staff, and so you need some board members to help. So there's a volunteer hat. When you leave a board meeting or a committee meeting, you almost literally take off the governance hat and put on the volunteer hat. That's what you wear most of the time. And that's when the board member is actually reporting to the CEO or another staff member. They're helping the staff implement, execute board policy. So be clear in board meetings not to have agendas that really talk about a management problem. If you have a management problem, invite a key board member who might know how to solve the problem to come over at another time and wear the volunteer hat. Then in small organizations, sometimes the board members are actually assigned to execute a board decision, not the CEO, where typically the CEO is assigned to execute. Sometimes you wear the implementer hat. You're a board member, yes, but the board passed a resolution to spend money on this or to investigate this. They thought you were the one best prepared as a board member to do that. So you go and you wear the implementer hat. And finally, there's the participant hat. You have an annual donor luncheon or dinner. You have a graduation ceremony. You want the board members to be there. It's just, hey, show up. We want to show that the board is involved and committed to our program. So you're just a participant at that point. So the four hats: teach it, help the board to not slip into the weeds of management while they're doing the work of governance. You don't want to depend on the board for the majority of your funding. Most people who would be great board members, they're going to look at whether the group functions well, whether they have a board policies manual, whether they understand the different roles of a board member. They want to join something that's a challenge, that's fulfilling. And if they get the impression that they're there just because of their money, they're going to tune out. But when they catch the vision and they have the passion, they're going to be helpful in finding people, finding family foundations, of which there must be 60, 70,000 now, finding the missions committees of the churches, even finding some government aid for some of the ministries that serve in the cities. They're eligible for government aid. Be careful on that, but many are successfully doing that. World Vision, for example, probably gets tens of millions of dollars of government aid to do what they do around the world. So those are some important things. Don't be tempted to think that the board has to reflect the constituency that you serve. So I've seen small nonprofits who serve the homeless, and some of the homeless people are well educated and so forth, but right now they're probably not a good prospective board member. Or immigrants, street kids, addicts. You're serving the least of these, and you'll find that people of wealth in the church, they feel called to help those people. They don't know how. So you're the connection. You're saying, if you feel called to help the groups that we're serving, We want to connect you. Would you like to visit one of our programs? Would you like to have more information about it? Would you like to visit a board meeting? In other words, you shouldn't load up on the board with the people who you're serving necessarily. They're the beneficiaries of your program. They aren't the moral owners, some would say. And those would be mainly your donors. So in larger organizations, you're probably jealous of them. They have a staff trained, professionally experienced in fundraising. So, gosh, I can think of many organizations I've worked with that have anywhere from 1 to 15 people who do nothing but fundraising. Most nonprofits can't afford that. So you have to bring people in, board, staff, donors, volunteers, and they all are made known of your needs. They all can be helpful. Finally, a thought on one of those questions you posed, Andrew, was how can staff, maybe you're not the executive director, maybe you're the bookkeeper, or you're a program person, what do you hope to be someday? Some of you are going to feel like God equipped you to be a leader. You'd like to be an executive director someday. Others of you have no interest in that. One of my best friends, who's been very successful, when I met him in his 20s, he said, Bob, he said, I never want to run an organization, but I want to be the best number 2 person any organization has ever had. And that's what he's done. He has been sort of the COO, the number 2 person in large organizations. And he's a successful consultant and coach as well today. So have a assessment of how God wired you, and then decide how you want to be involved. Staff have an enormous effect on governance. How? First, they help identify people from their church, their neighborhood, that could be good board members. Secondly, they should sit in on board meetings. If you help a board committee, you've written something for the board, you report directly to the executive director, paid or unpaid. Hey, have a separate table in the boardroom that these staff sit along the sidelines, so that the CEO, who is at the board table, generally I like CEOs who are ex officio on the board by position, they're on the board without vote. That's another whole set of issues. So you're in the boardroom, you're watching them, you're learning, you're debriefing with the CEO afterwards. What did you hear? What did you see? Then you're preparing those materials. And what do board members want from staff? They don't want pages of all that I've done since the last quarterly board meeting. They want to know, what are other organizations doing? How do we compare with them? They want to know that if in some area we're at 76% today, is that good or bad? Where were we a year ago, 2 years ago? Are we making progress? And they like visuals, they like charts, context, comparisons, visual representation of data, and staff do that. If staff give a board committee a whole list of stuff the staff is doing and what they're struggling with, what are you doing? You're inviting the board, wearing a governance hat, to delve into your management problems. You've got to break that early on, or 10 years, 20 years later, board meetings are brainstorming how to solve a management problem. They never get to governance, strategic thinking, strategic planning. So don't underestimate being a staff member who has influence in the level of excellence of governance where you work, where you serve.
Yeah, so there's, I think, a lot of lessons in there. And I'm going to try to kind of summarize some of what I'm hearing. On the question of, what about smaller organizations and younger organizations? I think what you're saying is there's those four hats: the governance, volunteer, implementer, and participant. And in my read, and I think I've seen this other places, is late stage organizations are extremely risk averse, or extremely, honestly bureaucratic usually. And they, and I think a lot of the late stage organizations would more follow the Carver model, where the governance is by far the dominant hat. Um, Whereas earlier stage organizations, it's going to be a lot more practical. If you've been around for 2 years and you only got a 50% chance of surviving in another 2 years, you're probably not thinking about, like, do you really need to have a 200-page policy manual to protect you from every possible risk that might happen? The more important thing might be to have board members that could volunteer or implement or participate. Is what I'm hearing you. Is that accurate?
Yes, but you do need the governance hat
Yeah,
in.
obviously you need that. It doesn't go away, but I'm just
Yeah.
saying, the level. If I had to say how much percentage of weight and effort on your board, it seems like governance goes up as the organization mature as a percent of the total board focus on the hats. Whereas early stage, it seems like some of those other hats might be more um, important. Is that
Yeah,
okay?
just separate them so you don't, you know, end up having a large management meeting instead of board members who come wanting to do
Right.
governance.
Yeah.
And
Basically, board members aren't free staff people. If you're going to have that, then you should just call them volunteers, not,
yeah,
have them be
yeah.
free staff people. Yeah. So that, I think
And
that's,
don't think you need 15 people on the board. Some boards work well without any committees. They're
yeah.
small, they deal with everything at a governance level in a half a day, quarterly, that's fine.
Yeah.
Boards who think that they're going to get more money if they bring on more board members. So I've worked with many, many boards of 20, 23, 28, 31. It becomes like going to a conference.
Yeah.
It's not an interactive dialogue around coming to grips with strategic direction, values, priorities. And right now with COVID-19, is a time for all of your students who are employed maybe with a nonprofit. I remember Jim Collins, I think it was, who said, you got to face the brutal facts. And Max Dupree said the first responsibility of a leader is to define reality. So a lot of ministries today say, well, we're just going to trust God. We'll get through this. We can go back to normal. No, there are tough, tough decisions.
Right.
Maybe you're doing 5 things. You got to cut out the 2 that aren't really effective in order to have the money to keep the 3 that are effective
Right.
going.
Yeah.
You may be laying off staff. You may be making just tough, tough decisions.
Right.
And staff, by the way you serve your CEO, and by the way, together you serve the board, you can be helpful in being really honest before the Lord in what the situation is, what's your reality today. And if you have to close with dignity, close with class. Maybe you want to merge, start talks about mergers with other similar organizations before you have nothing to bring to the table. Collaboration, partnerships, more important in the next 5 years than they ever have been. So staff, you're thinking about this every day, and I'm really glad to be able to interact with you or to be presenting some things that hopefully will be helpful to you. And God bless you in your critical role, as well as doing well in this course.
Yeah. So Bob, you started to get into answering another question I was going to ask you, and I think you basically answered half of it. A lot of our students aren't executive directors, and they're not going to relate directly to the board. In some case, what you said is, they should answer the question, is that something you aspire to, right? If you do, then this is actually super relevant. If you plan to be the head that's going to relate to the board, but if not, why is this still important? And I think that, one of the principles that we teach, in our courses is the principle of leading up. And in order to lead up, you need to understand what's important to your boss, and you need to understand what's important to your boss's boss, right? And ultimately,
Yeah,
the board is the boss's boss's, up the chain, right? And
exactly.
if you understand what the issues that they're concerned about, so like you said, as you're writing a policy manual, you're going to be thinking through, okay, here's how the board frames risk. Here's how the board is thinking about how we as an institution, what we're concerned about for risk. Some organizations are very concerned, like if you're working with kids, then some sort of sexual abuse risk might be huge for your organization. If your organization is, a lot of parachurch organizations are highly concerned about secularizing, over the long haul. And understanding what are the policies that your board's very concerned about, because those policies not just need to be at the board level, but they need to be implemented, at the lower levels. And it's not just understanding what the law is, but what the spirit of the law is. Because a lot of times what I see is that, people forget the reason for the rule and they start enforcing the rule, and then all of a sudden you lose it. So I think that that's a big part of this, of, why we're teaching, everyone who wants to do nonprofit management or be a, ministry leader about boards. But can you see any other reasons beyond what you covered before and what I said of why would, mid-level management in an organization, why would it be important for them to understand these principles?
Well, let's say you took 100 smaller ministries. More often than not, it's the staff, not always the CEO. They're consumed with all kinds of stuff. Often it's the bookkeeper or the program director who sees something and they say, wow, somebody mentioned liability to me at a gathering the other day. And so you dig into it, you Google and you find out, our board members, our volunteers, are they covered for liability? Well, some state statutes cover them pretty well. Other boards depend on your own individual insurance. Other boards buy officer and director insurance policies. Sometimes boards don't come up with these critical questions, like what was it that the government threw out to businesses and nonprofits recently? Sometimes it's a board member who brings it, and sometimes it's a staff member, maybe not the CEO. So your antenna are out all the time. You're trying to read things beyond your own internal materials. And sometimes you can save thousands of dollars, and sometimes you might come up with ideas of a new revenue stream. And a lot of nonprofits make it on fee for service. They're 10% dependent on donors. So there's no one that should be feeling as though I'm just a subject of what somebody else is deciding. No, you are a critical participant. So do your homework, talk to counterparts in other organizations, learn things, feed it not to the board directly. The board should have one agent, one employee, and then everything else is delegated below that. So if you're not the CEO, hey, you are eyes and ears for your CEO. And you don't want to wait until you want to be a whistleblower that something is totally bad here. You want to be bringing good ideas in the right way to the CEO and then to the board. You have a role in governance at whatever level you are in any ministry would be a thing to remember.
Yeah, yeah, that's really helpful. So yeah, that everyone has the governance value. I think part of what I hear you saying is reporting any risk identified up. You know, a lot of the people who work for me, they see the details. I don't see the details. So they will identify risk that I don't see. But it's the same thing, you know, to the through the board and understanding, you know, these values that you got to manage risk. You know, you need to have policies in place so that you don't get in a situation where you get sued because you don't have a policy, or you are exposed to risk because you don't have policies or procedures. And you know, all these principles. I think the bigger thing is if you're studying board management and you're not a CEO or executive director, then um, all the details may not exactly fit what you're doing, but all the principles apply, right? So the principle of using nonprofit best practices, the principle of, you know, having good policies, the principle of managing risk, the principle of understanding, you know, the organization's values and mission throughout the organization. I think that's really helpful. So, okay, one more question I have is, so say you have an organization and the existing board members only play a minimal role in fundraising. What would be your recommendation on how the organization could shift the expectations of board members to be more involved in fundraising? I think that's something that happens fairly common. It could be in other areas, you know, anything that you're trying to shift the culture of the organization or the board. But, you know, fundraising, I think, is one of the most common, where it starts off with someone's friends, and then, you know, you need to move as the organization matures. But how would you do change management in that process to shift the expectations with board members in fundraising?
Good data comes from a bookkeeper, and if you have a development staff person. And by the way, I know people 65 years old are bored. They were a good salesman for a company, a good corporate, what do you call those field reps? They know people, they know how to sell. They're bored to tears. Bring them on as $1 a year development director if you don't have a staff person. There are people who actually love fundraising. They may or may not be on your board. Another thought, if you don't have a development person, there are development consultants who actually say are retained for 1 day a week. You can't afford, they're probably 60, 70, 80, $150,000 salaries. No, you can't afford that, but you might be able to afford someone who would come in every Tuesday and train board and staff. They're professional fundraisers. They've decided to help more than one organization. That's another strategy. But the board has to understand they are responsible for the financial stability and sustainability of the organization. It's not the CEO. But many boards, when you're behind and you're in the red, you know, they think, well, we need a new CEO or whatever. You at the board, you're responsible. Ideally, you would hire a CEO, knows something about fundraising, and helps you become a fundraiser. But the board has to understand, ultimately, they are the legal, moral, financial entity, not a staff member. So if a CEO tries to take on too much, the board begins to think, well, if there's any problems, it's her problem. It's his problem. No. It's your problem. How are you going to solve the financial? They may decide that all of us have to pony up more. They may decide to add members to the board. They may decide to take on fee for service ideas. They may decide they have to partner with a wealthier organization. They may merge. All of those are board decisions. And they may or may not step up as a board to be a major funding resource. Ideally, more and more boards would do that. But if you have a fear of fundraising, you've never done it, you'd actually be terrible at it. You don't want to push those people to say, you know, by our next board meeting, we want everybody here to have made an ask 3 times. Well, you could hurt your brand by sending out some board members making an ask for money. So this thought comes to mind. It used to be 80-20, that 80% of the money from donors came from 20% of the donors, the old 80-20 rule. Today, in the last 5 to 10 years, it's 90-10. It's 10% of your donors are going to give you 90% of the revenue. So where should the CEO be spending his or her time? With the major donors. The ones who give 25, 50, and so forth, the more the merrier. You love them, you communicate with them, you encourage them. Some of them step up to be a major donor. Most of them will not, but you need them. So think about, how do I learn as a board member? How do I learn as an executive director to nurture major donors? And as I mentioned earlier, if you find a major donor who gives 100,000 away a year to ministries, they know 5 others who do the same. They hang out together. So where are they? Who knows any of those people? You need one of those in your team somehow.
Yeah, that's helpful. Well, Bob, any other advice beyond the questions I've asked so far? I don't know if I mean, you have so much knowledge that I we'd be here a long time if I was trying to extract all of it, but any other advice of things you'd like to say that I haven't covered?
Well, lots of things. I used to do day-and-a-half workshops and still didn't cover all that we could. So maybe a principle, this principle: assess, assess, assess. Build a culture of evidence. We don't want to just go on intuition and impressions and how we feel. How are we really doing? How do we measure that? Generally, things that don't get measured don't get improved. And we're in a business because of the mission, because of the need. We want to improve. Because we're doing the Lord's work, we want to do it with excellence. Because we want to be part of something that gets better and better, we need to invest in evaluation, assessments, gathering the right data, and presenting it to the board so that the board is willing to have it self-assessed. If I'm a board member and my 3-year term is up, am I willing for my peers to assess how I was as a board member? If we have 4 programs, how do we assess 4 programs? Because maybe we should be investing in only the 2 best and drop the other 2. So build a culture of evidence comes to mind, Andrew, as another principle for good, not only good governance, but good ministries.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we're hoping that in other parts in the course, we're covering a lot of these other things. I know that you could spend a lifetime learning all these, and that's what you've done. So thank you for sharing. I just want to share a couple resources for our students and for others who watch this. So Bob Andringa has a website called the andringagroup.com. Part of what is really helpful. And I said to Bob, he's not only the most knowledgeable person I know on boards, but he's also one of the most open-handed. He has his resources section here, and there's a lot of these documents are fairly long, but these are hugely helpful documents. And I've tried to condense some of the concepts from these and repurpose part of these, some of these in the course, but there's a lot more than what we provided. Another, organization that he recommended was Board Source. That's a subscription. I forget exactly what the pricing is if you go there, but Board Source is basically like the library. It's kind of the Netflix of everything board related. And if you as an executive director want to continue your professional development or help the professional development of your board, that's basically why Board Source exists. So well, thank you, Bob, for taking out the time. I really appreciate it. I want to honestly just ask you a lot more questions as I develop my own board. I'll try to compile some of the questions that students have, and maybe we can do another visit on this in the future. So.
Okay, good.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Bob.
My honor to be with you, Andrew. God bless you.
Okay. Thank you.